Now we're ready to dive in a little bit deeper on the androgens. So you can see on page 1 of your report, you've got the total of the DHEA metabolites and you've got testosterone. Now as we move to page 3, we've got a more detailed breakdown of these hormones. So we're looking at essentially 3 things here: DHEA levels, testosterone levels, and then the metabolism of the androgen. So let's start with DHEA. As we're looking at DHEA levels, what we want to do is to add up the 3 primary metabolites of DHEA. So we're measuring DHEAS, which is DHEA sulfate. That can be measured in saliva, that can be measured in serum or in urine. So we're looking at that here. But additionally, we're going to add the 2 most abundant metabolites of DHEA, etiocalanolone and androsterone. When you add those 3 up, you get a really good picture of the overall DHEA production for the day. So you'll find situations where those 3 may not entirely agree with one another. For example, if you have a situation where there's inflammation. If there's inflammation, it actually blocks sulfation. So you may have relatively low levels of DHEAS and higher levels of the other 2 metabolites. Again, the overall picture here is to measure all 3 and add them up, and that gives you a good idea of your overall production of DHEA. For testosterone, there's simply a single measurement of testosterone. You can see further on page 2 that the downstream metabolites of testosterone are also measured, and then for male patients we actually plot those on page 3 as well. So those can be considered. In female patients, those are of lesser importance, but we want to look at the overall DHEA, look at the testosterone, and then we want to look at the metabolism. So if we've got a patient who has, let's say, elevated levels of androsterone. Androsterone is a 5-alpha metabolite. On the other hand, etiocalanolone is a 5-beta metabolite. So if androsterone is elevated and the etiocalanolone is relatively low, what that tells you is that the metabolism tends to favor towards the alpha side of things. What does that mean? Alpha metabolites are more androgenic. Beta metabolites are less androgenic. Most famously, when testosterone pushes towards DHT, it has to go down the 5-alpha pathway. So what we see is, for example, in female patients, take a situation like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. Typically, there's an insulin issue in those situations which pushes 5-alpha. Because it pushes 5-alpha, when testosterone gets into the cellular space, be it a hair follicle or skin or what have you, you're going to get testosterone shifting more favorably towards DHT, and DHT is 3 times as potent as testosterone. So in women with thinning scalp hair, facial hair growth, acne, these are symptoms of high androgens, we want to look at the overall levels of DHEA. And you can look at that by looking at these 3 markers and the total. We also want to look at the testosterone, but here's a third thing that we can look at here is there androgenic metabolism? Is there metabolism where these androgens are moving more in a more potent direction? And if so, there are specific things that can be done to target that, to push back towards that beta pathway. So we want to look at a more comprehensive look at the androgens. Again, overall DHEA levels, the testosterone levels, and then the metabolism, whether it favors one way or the other. And you need to take all of those into consideration. For example, if a female has very low levels of all of her androgens, but happens to push down the alpha pathway, if there aren't a lot of androgens there to become more androgenic, you're not likely to see a lot of high androgen symptoms. On the other hand, if a woman's got high levels overall of her androgens and she pushes down that alpha pathway, you would expect to see a lot of high androgen symptoms. On the other hand, if you have these elevated levels, yet there's a real big preference for beta metabolism, then you may not see an exacerbation of those high androgen symptoms. In fact, you may have a person with slightly elevated levels who's not experiencing those high androgen symptoms, specifically because her metabolism is actually making each of those androgens less androgenic as they go through that metabolic pathway. So we want to consider the whole picture, overall levels of each of the androgens and the metabolism, and then we have a fuller understanding of what's going on with the patient and her hormones.